Hi, I'm Phil McLean and I work with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning for the Western Cape Government. Here we're looking at the Papenkuils Wetland, and wetlands are very special parts of the environment. We can see behind us how the clouds are raining currently in the top of the mountains. That water will filter down into rivers on those mountains, and those rivers will all feed down into this low area of the valley called a wetland, which collects all that water, stores some of it, filters some of it, and allows some of it to seep down into the groundwater so that it's available for farmers to when they drill boreholes. So this is what people would more typically expect of a wetland, because you've got all this water, and wetland here is doing its job. It's filtering water. It's taking that water that came from the catchment that might have been polluted with nutrients and heavy metals and even just sediment, sand, and it's spreading out that water and letting that sediment drop, that sand drop to the bottom, and then all these plants with their roots and even the standing up parts of the plant are filtering the water and taking out nutrients. And you'll see that in a typical wetland, all the plants are adapted to water flow. In some times of the year, the water will be up to my chest deep, and all of these plants then are designed to just bend over in the high water. They just wash straight over and they're not affected. They're not like trees that might snap or break, and then they stand back up as soon as the water gets lower again. And this area is alive with life. There are tadpoles. I can see small fish swimming in the roots and the leaves at the bottom here. We've seen dragonflies, and the sounds of birds are all around us here. And some of the birds are seed eaters that are eating the grass seeds that are here, and some of them are trying to catch little toads and froglets. And then there's even an eagle coming around there's a fish eagle that's going to get some of these baby fish when they're a bit bigger, and eagles trying to catch the other birds while they're here. So it's alive with life. What's interesting about wetlands all over the world, but particularly in the Western Cape, because we have a dry summer, some areas of wetlands, if you come at the wrong time of year, you might not recognize it as a wetland because it might not have this water. The water will dry down in this area in summer and be almost completely dry. So the plants that live here are quite cleverly adapted, because they at some times of the year are completely underwater, so their roots can't breathe, which is unusual for plants, which is why you don't see any trees in this environment, because trees, even their roots need to breathe, and in normal soil there's enough air that the roots can breathe, but underwater the water blocks out all the oxygen. So you've got all these plants, these grasses that can stand their roots being completely submerged and without oxygen for months at a time, but then also some other months of the year completely dry and hot. So these are things that will help you identify a wetland. In order to identify a dry wetland in summer, you just need to dig into the soil, because all wetland soils have a dark peaty layer. It's almost a black line, and that's from all the mud and the plant roots that gather during the wet season. So that will be a way of finding out if a place is a wetland, even if it's currently dry. So in a wetland, you often get wetland specific plants. This is quite a pretty one, and it's called the blue wetland pipes, Micranthus, and this often comes up at this time of year and flowers in the wetlands of the Western Cape. But on this one I found something very interesting. That bundle of sticks is not a bundle of sticks, it's actually something called a bagworm. There's a beetle larvae that's inside this tube, and he's hiding himself from birds that would eat him by covering himself with these twigs and stitching them together so that he appears to be just a dry twig. Then when you talk about wetland plants, there's a trick to identifying. These are two very common types of reeds, and this is called a juncus, and it's got a round smooth stem. This is a kind of sedge, and it's got a triangular stem. I don't know if that's obvious, but it's got a very triangular stem versus a very round stem. And the easy way that I remember it is they say sedges have edges. So this is a sedge with the triangular stem. So here we've got a diving water beetle. These little beetles come to the surface and they catch a bubble of water that they hold against their bodies so that they can continue to breathe and stay underwater, sometimes for half an hour or more. So pollution in wetlands is a significant problem in South Africa and the world, but one of the things that you don't expect is that nutrients are a form of pollution. So we often think of nutrients as a healthy thing, but in places where there's too much of it, particularly in flowing water, they can cause all sorts of problems. They can become so full of nutrients that they become poisonous to fish and frogs and wildlife. And so in this case, there's a lot of things like agricultural runoff, so fertilizers that are placed on fields that when it rains they wash down into the rivers. They can collect in wetlands because wetlands are low places in the valleys where everything that flows in collects in a wetland. So they are like buckets where you pour all sorts of things inside and they get stuck there. And so these nutrients and other pollutants flow down small rivers like this and end up in a wetland where they can be pollutants, cause things like the wrong kind of plants to grow, and they choke the water and they cover the surface so that light doesn't reach down to the bottom of the water, which also can take, when those plants die, they sink and they actually take all the oxygen out of the water as they rot underwater, and that causes the oxygen in the water to deplete, which means things like fish and frogs that need oxygen in the water to breathe actually end up dying. So nutrient pollution in a wetland or a river can cause fish to die because it causes plants to grow and then rot underwater, which takes away the oxygen. One of the other major problems of rivers and particularly wetlands is litter and solid waste. So we get a lot of things like plastics, especially because they float. They end up getting dumped into rivers and wetlands. A lot of people see wetlands as just an open space that isn't being used for anything else. So it seems like a good area to dump waste, household waste and all kinds of things. And so you often find wetlands are the victims of casual dumping, where people with a bucky load of rubbish just come and throw it into a wetland or around a wetland. All of those things contain chemicals and break down slowly or not at all, and so they choke up a wetland, and they obviously impact the life that's in that wetland. Wetlands are what's called receiving environments, so rivers flow into a wetland. So anything that is dumped or dropped or even blown into a river anywhere along its path will end up being received by the wetland, because the river will bring it to the wetland when it flows. So wetlands are often the seat of a lot of pollution and solid waste. One of the other things that often ends up in rivers is things like oils and heavy metals. From all of our vehicles, a small drop of oil that lands on the road, or a little bit of petrol that spills at the petrol station, and every time you apply the brakes, a little bit of metal rubs off from the brake pads and ends up as dust on the roads. Every time it rains, some of that gets washed off the roads, and it always ends up in a river that washes down into a wetland. And here you can even see some of the pond scum, this floating oils on the water. These are from oils that have been washed down from cars, and it ends up on the top of the water, and it's a pollutant. It also causes oxygen and light not to get into the water, and it can kill lots of the life that's inside the wetland.